How many different interpretations can you find of the statement in front of you? Let's read it. The complainant and her mother had been drinking at her house for 3 hours when she first became aware that several of her brother's gang members were waiting outside the premises. Stay tuned for a full analysis in order to overcome some of the common legal drafting errors for SQE2. Cue the jingle!
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQE2?
Those of you who are regulars to SQE TV will be familiar with our ABC of legal drafting: accuracy, brevity and clarity. Go back and watch the short just for a quick summary of that if you need to. But what we're going to do in this video is to do a deep dive into some of the SQE2 legal drafting performance indicators that the SRA have published to illustrate for you the sort of thing that the examiners are looking for.
SQE TV.
Now, the SRA has provided some really helpful guidance when it comes to demonstrating what competence looks like and where somebody is not yet competent for any of the skills that come up in SQE2. And they've done that for legal drafting, a link for which you'll see below this video. And looking at the slide here, the skill for legal drafting will include using clear, precise, concise and acceptable language. What does the SRA mean by that? Well, they mean the candidate's answer is consistently wordy, repetitive or confusing and cannot be easily understood. If you're doing that, you're suggesting that you probably don't demonstrate competence for the skill of legal drafting. So let's break that down and see what that means. When you're being wordy, what that means is don't use 10 words when 3 will do and achieve the same meaning. I know solicitors, we're often accused of using overflowery language. Don't do it. Simplicity is the best policy in almost all cases, whether it's in oral assessments, whether it's in written assessments or in practice itself. Don't be repetitive. That often happens when I see a document from a trainee or from a student, particularly if they're new to legal drafting. Just say something once, but make sure you say it in the right place. So it's essential to have a really good structure. So when you say something, you say it in the right place, and therefore it's not necessary to repeat it later on. Also, avoid repetition of long terms that can be defined. So things like a property, which has quite a long address sometimes, in a property deal, you'll just define as the property with a capital P, and then you just keep referring back to the property with a capital P. If it's a piece of litigation, it refers to a contract, rather than having to say the agreement between the claimant and the defendant dated the 13th of April 2024. You don't say that every time, you just define it once as the contract with a capital C and then each time refer to the contract for your later references. Don't use confusing or hard to understand language. That can often be ambiguous, and as we've said earlier, we've shown you a statement that's got many different interpretations. Always go back and look at your drafting and say, does it have the meaning that you intended? And sometimes it won't, and I still do that sometimes and look, oh, I think that might be interpreted the wrong way. Then tweak what you've written to make sure you remove any form of ambiguity.
SQE TV.
The SRA's performance indicator document for legal drafting is really helpful in a number of other respects, in that it shows further indicators where somebody's not achieving the required level of competence for legal drafting. Again, in relation to using clear, precise, concise and acceptable language. And in this case, the SRA says one indicator of not achieving that level of competence is where the meaning of the document can't be ascertained because it contains too few words. And I see this quite a lot of the time with candidates when they did the old LPC, but also candidates who are preparing for SQE2 are simply not writing enough. Now, there are two reasons for this. Firstly, sometimes candidates don't really understand what's expected of them when they're writing that particular type of document. So when you're drafting a particular claim or a report on title or the minutes of a meeting, do you understand what you're required to do by convention, but also to be effective in communicating what you need to do in that draft document? If that is the case, go back and look at the preparation course that hopefully you've done and make sure you're fully aware of the extent of what you need to say in that document. And a common mistake that students make when they don't write enough is simply to write the conclusion without giving the supporting facts or the supporting evidence. So let's give you an example in the context of a breach of contract situation. Now, a weak student would say something like, the defendant is in breach of clause 3.1 of the contract and therefore the claimant is entitled to claim damages. Now, that's just the conclusion, and it's very weak because it doesn't give you any meat on the bone. What was the contract? Who was it between? When was it dated? What does the clause say? How has it been breached? These are all things that need to be contained in a particular claim, and they need to be contained in the claim in a particular order so it makes logical sense, and you get marks for presenting it in that way.
SQE2.
Still on the subject of using clear, precise, concise and acceptable language, the SRA have set out further examples where the performance indicator document suggests that a candidate wouldn't be competent when it comes to the skill of legal drafting. And this further example we've got for you now on the screen is where the candidate uses unacceptable language. And what we mean by that is where they maybe are over informal or over casual in how they draft the document. So things like couldn't and shouldn't, we call those contractions where you've got a little apostrophe instead of could not and should not, are to be avoided. They don't sit very comfortably in a formal written professional document. So use the longer version without the apostrophes, without those contractions. Also, generally speaking, abbreviations are to be avoided unless you've already defined something as something and then you're using the abbreviation as a defined term. So, for example, the RSPCA, the Royal Society Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, might be defined as a party. It's quite a long phrase. It's perfectly acceptable to define them as an abbreviation, but don't just use abbreviations and assume that the reader knows what they mean. Also, make sure that you don't use slang. It goes without saying. In a professional document, you need to keep that air of professionalism going. And also, when you're referring, for example, to parties in a particular claim, don't say my client or our client. It's always the defendant or the claimant. It's very important that you refer to the parties in the third person from a professionalism point of view.
SQE2.
There's a further performance indicator that suggests a candidate isn't achieving the desired level of competence in relation to the use of clear, precise, concise and acceptable language. And that relates to where the candidate uses unnecessary technical or legal jargon throughout the document. And the key to success in making sure you avoid this is remembering who your audience is. Is it a sophisticated audience? Is it a mixed audience? Or perhaps it's somebody who's a layperson? The key thing you need to remember is who your audience is. So let's give you an example in the context of drafting a report on title. Now, you might need to draft a report on title, and you might draft it in two different ways for the same property depending on who your client is. If your client is a sophisticated investor of property like a buy-to-let landlord, then you can use some legal terms if you understand that the landlord has an appreciation of those terms, if it's reasonable to expect that they do. But on the flip side of that, if you're acting for a first-time buyer, buying the same property with the same issues, you'll have to explain in slightly different language what the issues are, and probably in a little bit more detail to spell things out. But you simply wouldn't need to do that in as much or quite the same way for a sophisticated client. So the key to success in avoiding this pitfall is know who your audience is and draft accordingly.
SQE2.
So let's return to the statement we looked at right at the beginning of the video, the one that has multiple interpretations. The complainant and her mother had been drinking at her house for 3 hours when she first became aware that several of her brother's gang members were waiting outside the premises. So where's all the ambiguities here? You might want to pause the video and work out what they are and then continue the video in a few moments' time. Let's assume that you've paused the video and had a look. What's the answer? Well, the complainant and her mother had been drinking at her house. Well, if the complainant is female, whose house is it? Is it the complainant's house or her mother's house? That's not clear. They were there for 3 hours when she first became aware. Well, who first became aware? Was it the complainant, if it's a female complainant? Or is it the mother that first became aware? And several of her brother's gang members. So whose brother are we talking about? Probably the complainant if it's a female complainant, but it might be the mother's brother. We simply don't know. So again, that's ambiguous. And again, there's an ambiguity at the end. We're waiting outside the premises. Now, do we mean the house where they've been drinking, or do we mean licensed premises like a pub or some other premises? I simply don't know from just reading that statement. So always critically analyse your drafting for any forms of ambiguity and go and just give a little tweak where necessary to remove that ambiguity, and therefore you'll maximise your chances of passing the assessment.
SQE2.
that was a quick look at some of the practical tips we've got for you when it comes to the legal drafting assessment for SQE2, what to do and the common pitfalls to avoid. And if you want to see more of this content as you prepare for your SQE2 assessment, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap the notification bell you can see on the screen right here. That way you can find out as soon as our videos drop. Thank you once again for watching SQE2V. We love it when you do, and in the meantime, as we always do when we finish an SQE2V video, we say it's now time for the jingle.
If you wanna